As we continue to prepare for this final exam, the next 15 days are going to be very similar. The main intent is for us to go over the 12 chapters and just do the highlights of the reviews and get some multiple choice and free response practice in. I do encourage you to take this practice over the next 15 days as the real exam and not to use your notes if you don't have to. You're going to be graded on participation and not on accuracy for this. So basically the 4 steps we're going to follow is every day we're going to have in step 1, we're going to review some of the basic highlighting concepts of that topic for the day. Step 2 then, you're going to try some multiple choice questions. These are actual past multiple choice questions. I'm going to set the timer on these at 2.5 minutes per question. Your real test is 90 minutes for 40 questions, which is about 2 2/4 of a minute per question, so you have a little bit more time on that one. The correct answers will be given to you after the assessment so you can see how it should have been done. The second thing you're going to do in our step 3 is there's going to be a free response. Now, I can't time the free response because it's just a standard assignment, but you'll want to allot yourself about 10 to 15 minutes per free response and just see how long it takes you. If you get a number 6 free response, then that one I would give yourself about 25 minutes to look over and see how you can be doing that. The number 6 questions are topics typically that you've never been taught, and they want to see how you can handle those. The number 6 question is worth twice as many points as number 1 through number 5 are, so it's important to put more time into number 6. Typically, a number 6 question is 3 parts. The first 2 parts are something that have probably been taught in our course, but the third question typically, again, is something you haven't seen and they want to know how you would handle it. The fourth thing to keep in mind on every day's review is, do you have any specific questions? Please do use the question board. It's the final review discussion, so we can accumulate all of your questions and people can use that as a resource to see if their question has been asked and if there are any answers for that. Keep in mind you can always go back to various chapters and study them. Anything in semester 2, which again was going to be chapters 8 through 12, we can easily access. To access anything from chapters 1 through 7, you do have to go to your courses and the archive and pull up the first semester. Always use the question boards, email me, or swing on in with any questions you may have. So first in our review is topic 1, which is about exploring and describing data. This encompasses chapters 1, 2, and 3. So for today's review, we're just going to focus on chapter 1 and its highlights. Now the resource you're seeing here on the screen can be found on your own screen on your computer or in your note packet. So I gave you a variety of places to have it as a resource if you're more of a paper-based student or more of an electronic-based. I think it's important for you to go ahead and read the learning objectives that you did cover in chapter 1 when you were learning about single variable data. I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights in more detail, others I won't. I do encourage you to read it and make your own notes. Some of the key things for vocabulary, remembering individuals, variables. You do want to understand the difference between categorical and quantitative. Remember, quantitative, that's when we do anything for the means. Categorical is going to be for the proportions. And when you have a distribution and you have to describe it, you do not want to forget your socks. You must talk about shape, center, and spread. And that applies to all topics, just not coming out of chapter 1. Now, when we got into section 1 of chapter 1, they introduced frequency tables and relative frequency tables. Remember, frequency is count, relative frequency is percentages. If you're comparing 2 sets of data that don't have the same number of variables in them or subjects in them, you cannot compare frequencies because that's not equal. You must compare relative frequencies, so that's important to keep in mind. You probably will not be asked to analyze pie charts, but you're going to have to analyze bar graphs. Remember, bar graphs look like histograms, but the bars do not touch. Two-way tables are just a way that we could look at some possible frequency tables or other data. We also talked about marginal distributions and conditional distributions. Marginal is really the totals of all of our rows and our columns. Conditional distributions deal with the subsets within the table. So we're not looking at all of the data, but just parts of it. And then this is when we started talking about association of how things are related in order to get us related to doing our inference tests later on in the chapters of the book. Section 2 then brought us into looking at those frequencies. If we have small sets of data, a dot plot is a great way to look at the shape of that. A stem plot could be good also. A histogram is when you had more data, typically 40 or more pieces of data. And again, this is like a bar graph, but they are touching and they show our intervals. When they ask you again about describing or the overall pattern, shape, center, and spread must be talked about. Most of the rubrics are going to say you have to talk about these three components. The outliers aren't always necessarily defined in the free responses to have to be talked about. But what you do want to talk about, if there are any obvious outliers, you must mention that, or some departures or gaps or something different in the data. In addition to shape, center, and spread, talk about the real unusual things that you're seeing. For shape, we know we could have symmetric or skewed right or skewed left. Remember, skewed right, it means the tail is on the right-hand side, and skewed left, it's on the left-hand side. When you compare distributions, if you had a free response that said compare the two distributions, you have to compare the shape, the center, and the spread. Look at the shape of the distribution to determine what center and spread you should do. If you have a symmetric distribution, they would recommend mean for center, and then you could do variance or you could do range for spread. If it's skewed though, you want to be careful. Skewed data is impacted by the outliers. It's not resistant to the outliers. So what you want to talk about for shape on here is that the skewness, but for the center would be the median, and for the spread would be your IQR. The other thing about comparing distributions, even if you pick like the mean of one distribution and the mean of the other, they want you to say how it compares. Is it lower than? Is it higher than? Put that descriptor in there on how the actual two compare to each other. The third section really talked more about the quantitative data, which we've kind of already addressed in terms of when you talk about the distribution, we talk about center and spread. Dependent on the shape, which center and spread should you talk about. Remembering what IQR is. IQR is the interquartile range. It is Q3 minus Q1. The quartiles themselves will divvy up the data into 4 groups of 25% of the data each. So it's a nice way to see where the middle of the data is, the top 25% of the data, and so forth. You will want to know how to apply the outlier test. Remember, the outlier test is taking Q1 and subtracting from it 1.5 times the IQR, and taking Q3 and adding to it 1.5 times the IQR. Anything outside of this range on the lower high end is an outlier. It actually can equal this data value that you compute, but it can't be lower than that or higher than this one. The 5-number summary is just the numerical list of what makes up the box plot. Remember, it's our minimum, Q1, medium, Q3, and maximum. We then look at variance, which can give us our standard deviation. Remember, the definition of standard deviation is on average how much a piece of data varies from the mean. A resistant measure, this is one that is not impacted by the outliers. Remember, if we have a skewed distribution, that distribution is going to be non-resistant to those outliers, so it's going to change. Because of that, on skewed distributions, we do look at IQR and we look at median because they're not impacted as much by those outliers as mean and variance or standard deviation are. Now, I do recommend you can look through your Chapter 1 note packet. Hopefully you have kept those. If you want even more specific details about those highlights, dig through that packet first, and then I would say jump into today's assignment, which again is graded on participation. You're going to have your multiple choice, all related to Chapter 1. Make your submission and you can check your answers and see if you are correct or not. And I do have feedback on the various responses. After that, please try this free response. You can open it up. You can print out the free response, but it should be in the packet already. When you're done with that, I do recommend trying the free response, writing it out in the packet, and then clicking onto this assignment, opening up the rubric and doing a self-scoring for it, and just see how you did. You do not have to upload this free response. This is just one for you to try and grade on your own. And this right here is the actual free response I'm going to have you try. It's from the year 2000. It's question number 3. So for time, give yourself 10 to 15 minutes for this one. Please don't try to look up the answer ahead of time. Try this on your own, write it out in your packet, then go back to that assignment and open up the rubric and score it and see how well you did. Feel free to ask me any questions you have along the way. And good luck in your first review session for Topic 1.